So in the last video, we modified our plugin to make it easier to navigate around inside existing notes files. So in this video, let's make it easier to actually create those note files in the first place. Hello everybody, ODAT Nerd here, back with a fourth video in this small series on plugin development in Sublime following the development of this simple notes plugin. And as I've said many times before, if you are unfamiliar with this plugin and what we're working on here, there's a link down in the description to the first video in this series that explains how this code on the left works and how we came up with it. And through the other videos in this series, we have enhanced the functionality of this simple notes plugin. There are links down in the description as well, also to the code, both of this step and of previous steps in the series if you want to see the genesis and evolution of the code. Now, in the last video, we enhanced the plugin so that simply by having the cursor inside of a tag when we invoke the command, it automatically jumps to the top. And similarly, we can select a tag and run the command to do the same thing. And that ties in with being able to navigate around in the symbol list. But what if we had a brand new notes file and we actually wanted to create one? Well, we could say have a note for hashtag code because this is some code and have a couple of paragraphs there. And then we would continue on. But as our notes files get bigger, we're going to have more sets of notes, but we probably want to keep a consistent set of the tags that we're using. Because remember, the whole point is to not only be able to tag them this way, but be able to call those tags to the top and navigate them. So it probably behooves us to always tag things that are code with code and whatnot. And we'll see that if I open the autocomplete manually here, I can see code, which is the tag I used, but I can also see words from the buffer. And even if I didn't do that, pushing tab cycles through words in the buffer. So while it's technically feasible for us to, if we just kept hitting the button enough times to eventually land on something that looked like a tag, it probably behooves us to try and modify this particular system to not do that. And here's something else to note. I'm going to create a new scratch buffer of type HTML and add a document inside here. Now in the general case, when I type, I get no autocomplete. But if I was to type a tag, immediately the autocomplete pops up. Now, say we want that sort of functionality, how can we accomplish that in our plugin? Now, there are two settings that we could use to control this. So let's go into the preferences and bring that over to the appropriate monitor and jump it up like so. And those settings are these ones. This one, the Autocomplete Selector, controls scopes in which the autocomplete triggers automatically. Now we haven't seen that in play yet, but if I was to say create a Python, whoops, and come down here, when I type, it automatically pops up, right? When it thinks I'm typing something. Or here's for loop function and so on, if I could type. That's in contrast to just having a plain text file where we don't see it pop up ever, right? Unless we manually invoke it, which we generally don't because all we get in there are word completions from the current buffer. But That's what this autocomplete selector is saying. Control the scopes that autocomplete will trigger in. So let's go ahead and bump that over to our own settings and zoom that panel and take a look at it. Now, as a selector, this is one of the more complicated ones. And again, we don't want to talk fully about what selectors are in this case. It's a fairly big topic, but in general, anything that's a meta.tag, if that's what the scope is, autocomplete opens, but not when it's also the definition of a tag beginning. Similarly, anything that is a type source, of which source.python is one, then do it there, except not in comments and not in various kinds of strings. So trivially, if I added another one and said text, like so, now over here, every time I type, I get a completion pop-up. We could do that in our notes field, but since our notes files are primarily text-based, that is a little irritating and probably not what we want to do. So let's go ahead and remove that setting. And what we will use instead is this one, the autocomplete triggers, which, as the name suggests, specifies additional settings or additional situations in which autocomplete triggers. And this is what we saw in the HTML file. When I typed that character, that's what told it that it should open the autocomplete, and the selector is text.html. So this is a dictionary. I could add a new one and say that for the character hash, when the selector is text plain notes, open the autocomplete. And I'll just jump over to this file. And now when I type the hash, the autocomplete automatically opens, although it is still showing buffer completions. And when I type, I get no completions, which is what we want if we ignore that I'm having a hard time typing tonight. So that is totally something that works. Now, we could leave it like this, and you can do that. I'm going to do something slightly different. And what I'm going to do is cut that out of there, close the regular preferences, and open the SyntaxSpecific Settings instead. And I'll paste it in here. And in this case, we don't care about that one. We only care about this one. Now, the syntax-specific settings, as that comment says, they override both the user and the default settings when the current file is using the notes syntax, which is what this is doing. So this will automatically apply this setting that opens the autocomplete when the hash is present in the file, only within notes. Now, this is functionally identical to what we just did, but in the next video, we're going to show how we can very easily turn this into a package and share it with other people. And in that case, let's presume that you want to give them a ready-to-go solution where you can say, here's the package. There may be some customization preferences you can apply if you want, but by default, you want autocompletion to work on notes. Now, this is indeed a judgment call because perhaps there are people that don't like to use autocomplete at all, in which case they might be angry that you have this setting, and they would have to go into their notes.sublime settings and create an override for that, if you will, that stops this setting from applying. And so this is really a judgment call, and it comes down to how you want to work and what you perceive the greatest number of people, what's going to make the greatest number of people happy. Because if I do it this way, then people that don't like autocomplete are going to be unhappy. But if I don't do it, then people that do like autocomplete are going to be, if not unhappy, at least inconvenienced in that they have to go ahead and add this setting themselves. So that's my explanation for that. But now with that in play, we can go ahead and do that. Now, this part of the way there, we're getting our autocomplete popping, but how do we actually provide those completions? Well, there are 3 ways that we can do that. Now, the first one would be to create a snippet. Whoops. I meant to type new snippet. Silly me. Now the contents of the snippet will be the content of the tag that we want to create, the note we want to create. So let's say the content of the tag we want to create is Python 2, because we're going to tag some things that work in Python 2 in our notes file. And we're going to actually want a tab trigger for that. And we'll say that the tab trigger is Py2, let's say. And then thinking about it, we think, well, we're automatically opening the autocompletion buffer when we enter the hash, so the hash will already be there. Let's go ahead and remove that so that it expands the way we want. We would also probably want to set this scope to, right now it'll apply just to Python files, but we probably want to set that to text.plain.notes. And if you're unfamiliar with why we're choosing that scope here and why we used it in that setting, that's explained back in video 1 when we created the syntax for the notes files that we see on the right-hand side of the screen. Now I'm going to save that as py2.sublime snippet. Again, it goes into my user package by default. And automatically, when I type py2 and hit tab, I get that completion. And if I try to open the autocomplete, because that's the only completion that matches right now, it expands out right away. So that's doing what we want. But we don't always work with Python 2. Sometimes we work with Python 3 too. So how would we add Python 3 to this? Well, we can't because this is a snippet. So we would need to create one for Python 3. And we could just save as this, but I want to have both of them open easily at the same time. So I'm going to say new view into file, and then close that file, save this as Python 3, and then change that and that both to a 3, and save it. And we can reopen the previous file, scoot it down there, so we can see the two of them in play at the same time. And now I can come over here and say py2 and hit tab. I can say py3 and hit tab, and I can type py, and that doesn't autocomplete. But if I open the autocompletion buffer, I can see this text here. The left is the trigger. It says py2 because that's what the tab trigger is, and py3. And on the right, we also see py2 and py3, and that's because that's what I named those snippets. And that's not a particularly handy way to go about that. But we could perhaps modify this so that this also was Python 3 and this one was Python 2, because that's the full word. And then when we come over here and open the autocomplete, now we get better action there. We could also add a description tag to the snippets to change that one on the right to specify that this is a note of some sort, if we care. But I'm still having problems hitting the one I want in a short manner. And this isn't a particularly good way to go. And part of the reason for that is snippets are fairly powerful in that you can have as much content in here as you want, and realistically, the only character that's magic in here is the $sign character, because it's used to define fields in the snippets. And if you're familiar with snippets, you know that we can make a complicated one. Even like that, the sample that popped up when we create a blank snippet using the tools developer new snippet thing. It allows you to expand a big glob of text and even tab through it, modifying parts of it as you go. It's really great for templating things, if you will. And so it's a little heavyweight for what we're doing here. And note that each of these files is 9 lines long. They would be 7 lines long if those comments weren't there, or 8 if we added the description so we would actually know what these are. And that's like a ratio of 1 line to 7 lines of stuff just to make one of these things appear. So perhaps that's not the way we want to do that. So let's go ahead and send those to the trash. And go back to the 2-column layout. Now, what's the second thing? Remember I said there were 3. The second thing is the Sublime completions file. And we can easily create one of those using package dev. And we can immediately see this whole file is 7 lines long. It's a lot more compact. And I can change this scope to text.plain.notes to make sure these completions only happen in the notes. And then this action is very similar to how the snippet works. The trigger would be the trigger text, and let's go ahead and type Python 2 in there directly. And then the content is the content that expands, and we could say Python 2. Don't trigger Python 2 to expand Python 3 or your head will explode. And then we'll duplicate that and change both of those to 3 and hit save. And I got to name the file. It's still in my user package. I'm going to name it notes because it's, as we can see here in this prompt, it's very similar to the name of the syntax and the settings. And it's keeping everything that's related to this plugin, except for the name of the plugin Python file itself, very similar as we go forward. And just like that, with that saved, when I come over to this buffer, as soon as I hit that, Python 2 and Python 3 are the first items in the list, and I can expand it. I can hit Py, and it goes to Python 2 automatically, and then it goes to Python 3, and then back to Python 2. I can say Py 2 and hit Tab and get the one I want, or Py 3 and hit Tab. So automatically, this is doing a lot for us. And note that it's very easy for us to add completions to this file. Now that the whole file exists, adding one line to this file adds a new completion to the buffer for us. Now, the downside to a Sublime completions file is that this is a JSON file and not an XML file. And although they work the same way, there's a lot more characters that are special here because of the format of the file. Not just the $, as was the case in the snippet file, but if you wanted to have a quote in here, well, you'll see that's breaking the syntax. Because this is JSON, you have to quote that character to have it injected inside of the completions. And heaven forfend, you want to have a $, and have it be a regular $, in the completion, because you would have to / quote that character to make it regular, but this is actually being interpreted as a character escape on the $, character, which is not valid JSON. So you actually have to have 2 like that, so that the JSON parser says, when I see // I insert a /, and then when Sublime examines the file, it sees $. So that's very much the reason why you would choose a snippet over a completion. But for our purposes, this is perfect because it's the expansions are very small. And as a matter of fact, because it is so common to have something that triggers and have a contents that are the same, you are allowed to modify the buffer or the copy of the contents to just this format. This is still a list, but now it's strings instead of objects. And Sublime automatically knows when it sees just a string that you intended for the character and the text and the expansion to be identical. And so this still works exactly the way that it did before. But note we have a problem with it still pulling words from the buffer. So this isn't a complete solution, but this does allow us to inject our own tags that we most commonly use into this buffer. Now, what is the third way? For now, let's shoot that down there so we can just keep that open. And as a matter of fact, I'll use the mouse and size that pane down a little bit so it doesn't take up a lot of space. The third way to do something like this and inject completions is to write what is called an event listener. And much in the same way, here we have defined a command. We can create an event listener. And the difference between those is that a command is for taking an action, and an event listener is for having a reaction. So action, take this tag, move it to the top of the page. reaction, someone just modified the buffer and I'd like to make some changes or update my internal state. Or action, the user inserted some text. Reaction, the file is about to be saved. I want to reformat the code in it to make it look nice before it gets sent to disk. You get the idea. And there are a fair number of events that we can define. And in fact, there are a couple of ways to create event handlers, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. So we need to create a class for our event handler. And I'm going to call it the tag event listener. And the name doesn't really matter. It's only for your own edification because this is something to do with tags. That's what I'm going to call it here. And the superclass is event listener. And then we need to define an event. And the event we want to define is the onQuery completions event, and it takes several parameters. I'll just go ahead and type those in here. We get the view that the completions are going to happen in. We get the textual prefix of the text prior to the cursor if we care. And we get a set of locations in the file where the completions are going to happen. And we are tasked with returning back the completions. And I'm just going to shoot that to be return none, which is functionally identical to having the pass there because functions that don't return an explicit value return none by default, but we like to be explicit so everyone knows what we meant to do. And I'm going to go ahead and save that, and everything still seems to be okay. Now let's look at the help. Now we can see there are two different onQuery completions. There's event listener and view event listener. Now they both work 99% identically, and structurally the difference is here, as in our event listener, we get told the view that the event is going to happen in, and when Sublime loads this plugin, it creates exactly one instance of this tag event listener class, and it's for every view. And that's why we get provided a view when it's called. The flip side of that is the view event listener class. And in that case, this event looks very similar to this, but it doesn't get a parameter of view. And the reason for that is Sublime creates one instance of this class for every view that there is. And it also has a class method that allows Sublime to ask it, here's a view. Do you apply as an event listener? Do you apply to this particular view? And you can say yes or no. The default is to say yes. So very, very vaguely, the two reasons you would choose a view event listener is if you had some sort of persistent information that it's easier to work on your code if you could use instance variables because you are guaranteed that there will be a new instance of view event listener. Or if your code is very specific to a certain type of file, you might also want to do that. I'm going to go the other way and use onQuery completions. From the regular event listener class. And this explains the information that I just sort of gave you there. This event listener can return one of three things: a list of things, a tuple, or none. What you return changes what happens. And this is called when completions are to be presented to you. And the important thing to note here is prefix is the text to the left of the cursor in the buffer, but not all of the text in the cursor, only up to the first word separator. So if the cursor was, right here, the prefix is the word provide. And here, the prefix is the word offshoring. The idea being perhaps you want to customize the completions you give based on the text that comes before the cursor. And locations is a list of points. And again, just like in a region, a point is just an offset in the buffer. And because there can be more than one cursor, there can be more than one location in the that is provided to you. And so that allows you, if you wanted to examine the point in the buffer at which the insertion is going to happen to see what should be injected there, this allows you to do that. Now, the different return values are none, no completions are provided, and that is what we have right here. So right now this class functionally does nothing. Every time completions are about to be prompted or shown to the user, this event gets triggered, on query completions get called, we say, we got nothing for you. And Sublime ends up just using the completions that it already has, which includes words from the buffer. Alternatively, we could return a list of two-element lists / tuples. That's the first element being the trigger text and the second one being the replacement text. And that looks startlingly familiar to that text in the notes.sublime completions at the bottom of the file. So let's go ahead and try to implement that. And again, we could just say return, and we are returning a list of items or a list of tuples, but we're going to say the first thing is, let's say Python 2, and the completion is Python 2, like that, and come down here and change those to 3. And plugin still loads. You'll notice as you go through these videos, I'm a very defensive programmer. We jump over to here, and I come down, I type hashtag, opens up the list, and there are automatically the Python 2 and Python 3, but there's also another Python 2 and Python 3. And the reason for that is the list includes completions that are returned by for the event listener and completions that are injected by Sublime completions and then words in the buffer. And as a matter of fact, we can modify this by saying, if we added a note tag here, I probably should have did that with multiple cursors, huh? And added a note tag here to this one as well. When I save the plugin and come over here, you can see those ones are of type note tag. These are the ones that are coming from the Sublime completions. Now in the general case, it's not the worst thing in the world if this was the case. Now remember, in our real quote unquote on query completions, we wouldn't just return a static list like this, or at least not just a static list like this, because there's really not a lot of utility to it, although we'll see in a second that perhaps there is, because we can do the same thing with completions and then we don't have to fiddle around with code. But the downside is if I type pi and hit tab, I get Python 2, then Python 3, then Python 2 again, which is what I might expect, then Python 3, then Python 2, then Python 3. It's going through them all. And depending on how the contents of the buffer and how things all work out, that list might stutter step. For example, if the completions in the bottom file said 3.2 instead of 2.3, when you did this, you'd see Python 2, then Python 3, then Python 3, then Python 2, and it seems like it's not doing what you want it to do. Now, note there's a third thing you can return, which is a two-element tuple with the first element being the list formatted like above, and the second being a bit flag with these two things: inhibit word completions and inhibit explicit completions. So let's investigate how those work. I'm just going to copy that and close this because we're not going to need it for a little bit here. And I'll paste that there and comment them both out. And the thing we want to try first is this. I'm going to copy that. Now remember, the whole return value has to be a tuple, so it needs to be in parentheses. The first item is the thing we were already returning, and the second item is inhibit word completions. Now before I hit save in there, let's be reminded that if I come over here and hit P and open the autocomplete. These are the two completions from the plugin. These are the two from the completions file. And these are words from the buffer, which probably are going to get in our way more times than they're not. And by adding inhibit word completions, just that easy, the completions from the buffer are now gone. And similarly, you might automatically presume that if we were to add explicit completions, the same could be true. Whoops. Let's copy it and not. Well, you know what? Let's do it this way. If we just have explicit completions in the list, now when we come over to our sample and open it, now there's only the explicit completions are gone. So these are the ones from the plugin. These are the words from the buffer, but the ones from the Sublime completions file are now the ones that are missing. And of course, you could also add both of them in instead of just one, in which case, when you open the item, only the notes from the Sublime completions file are the ones that pop up. So let's say on the whole, what we want is to definitely inhibit word completions like that. We can leave that part out for now. We'll see how that all shakes out. But just by doing that, we now no longer get completions from there. So now it's a lot easier for us to hit the things we want without accidentally hitting those other ones. Now this is, again, providing us just a list of explicit plugins or tags, in the plugin, which is the same as that completions. And this isn't really what we would do here, right? What we would actually do is gather the tags from the file and present those under the assumption that if you've used a tag before, you probably want to use it again. And how could we do that? Well, we already know how to do that. We could say find tags on the view that was provided, and that's going to return us a list of all of the unique tags. But those tags, and let's go ahead and do this just to see. When I query completions, we can see these are the tags that are currently in the file, code and Python 2. But they have that hash mark in them, and we've already determined that we don't want to have that hash in there. But we can use the list comprehension and a string slice, like so, to iterate over all of the tags and take them from the first character on, which throws away that leading hash character. And with that in place, when I open it, now we just get the tags as we would expect them to exist there. And if that's the case, let's see if we can craft a return that's going to do what we want. So let's say the first thing we want is a return of a tuple, the same as we did before. And just like before, we want to inhibit the word completions from the buffer, like so. But, well, I guess we do want that on its own line, don't we? And here is where we would put our list of items. Now, both of these are essentially the same thing, right? They are the tag. You know what? And let's work this out piecemeal just to make sure that we know how to do it. So let's copy that. That's our reference implementation. This is returning all of the tags with that first character trimmed off. If I was to add an extra set of brackets or square brackets around that, then when I invoke the autocomplete, you can see I get a list of lists, but the items in the list are only one thing. So I could say tag 1, like so. Now, when we come over here, and let's do it in that order, now we're getting a list and a list. We really like having that, let's say that note tag text on there though, just to remind us. So we can add or append onto this the text note. Yeah, let's say note tag. That seems like a good name. And now code/t note tag code/t note tag. That seems to be exactly what we want to have in our little list. So let's cut that out, delete that, come down here, uncomment this. Now, I could have just typed that out, but it seems to me that it's a good idea sometimes to clarify your thoughts for what you're trying to pull off. I guess that doesn't really need to be that way, does it? I broke it by deleting the wrong stuff. A list of lists. What did I do wrong? Let's take it all back and go again. So that does what we want. Did I inject that the wrong way? No, I didn't. Okay, that's what I meant to pull off. So in the world of the purely confusing, now we're getting the tags in the file plus those ones from the completions. All right. So if I tagged this as tag 1, now tag 1 is in the list. I can type that as tag 2. Tag 2 is in the list, T12. So that's working good, but it does give us some of these multiple times. Now, this particular one isn't in the file yet, but that one is, and it's appearing twice. So let's assume that we don't want to do this via notes. Via a Sublime completions file. Let's go ahead and just delete that for the time being, and again, go back to the 2-column layout. So this we also no longer need. I leave it to you to decide if you wanted. We could have also just added inhibit explicit completions and rejected that completion file entirely, right? Maybe this is easier to read if it looks like that because it's a tuple, or maybe it's better when it looks like this. To decide which way looks best for you. We probably don't need a return none here. But let's go ahead and just experiment with some other things here. Because we'll note, if I open the auto completion right here, what happens? No available completions there. What if I had a text file? No available completions. Well, the important thing is we want to actually, we're getting invoked with, oh, I see what I did there. In the general case, this is more or less working the way we want it to, but it's kind of working by accident because the list of completions that we return back is dependent on find tags, finding something in the view. And find tags is dependent on finding things with by entity.name.tag. And right now in this file, there aren't any. And in a plain text file, there aren't any, so no completion happens. In an HTML file, when I open the auto completion, and I'm going to go ahead and do that, notice we're seeing awk-type, audi, ed, tml, and idle, which are all tags because our plugin is finding these because they are of scope meta.entity.name.tag. And because it's finding them, it's adding them to the auto completions. And as a matter of fact, it's blocking the auto completion, for some things in some cases. And it's throwing away the first character because our plugin is throwing away the first character. So what we really need to do is make sure that this only happens in files of type notes. And one way to do that would be to use that view event listener, because you could get it to trigger only when the syntax setting was set a certain way. But another thing we could do is say view.matchSelector. And we're going to pass that, remember, a point and the selector to match. And we could say text.plain.notes. But what point do we pass it? Well, in our case, we know that this entire notes file is of type text plain notes. So we could just add a 0 here and say, if not, match selector 10 text plain notes, return none. Otherwise, return the list of items. And then over here, we're still seeing our tags. But over here, we don't see any completions because we don't have any tags. So we've solved that particular problem. This locations can be a list of one or more places in the file, and the scopes can be different for those multiple places. For example, here the scope is just text plain notes, but here the scope is text plain notes, meta notes tagline. And let's assume we weren't inside a tag at the time. So if we wanted to only autocomplete things on lines that already had tags, we would say view match selector text plain notes meta notes tagline. And most of the time that would work until the situation like this, where there's two cursors and one of them is in the tagline and one of them is in the content of the buffer. And in that case, the scope doesn't match in that second one or in that first one. So it would try to put the completion in there even though it's not supposed to. And so a way around that would be to use something like this. If not all, view.matchSelector p. Well, I'm going to say it this way for brevity. Text plain notes. For p in locations, return none. We'll comment that out. Now, remember, all is a Python function that goes over a list and only returns true or false if everything in the item in the list returns true. So if not every point in the locations matches this selector, then don't inject any completions. Again, for us, that doesn't make any sense because everything's already text plain notes. But if we added the meta taglines scope to this, that would allow us to ensure that only those particular lines with the tags is where the injection happens. Now, similarly, and this is something that we didn't point out before, complete for this. Now let's see how that plays into what we're doing over here. So every time the autocomplete opens, we get it printing something. And right now the prefix is blank string because there's nothing to the left of the cursor. Now it's tag 2. And see, it automatically stopped at that word separator like I mentioned before. And here it's still empty because it doesn't loop around to the next line. You could still figure out what was on the prior line by using the location if you cared. Similarly, here there's nothing because a period is a word character. And here, the previous text is offshoring. And what if I had a cursor here and a cursor here? What do I see in the prefix? I don't see anything in the prefix. And why is that? Because you can't autocomplete something from two radically different prefixes because they don't match. How would it know which thing you meant to put there? But this way, well, I have to do that so we can see the console. Now we get an A. Now again, we don't want to do this in this file, but if you wanted to, you could examine that prefix and see what completions you want to return back. An example of that would be using the filter function to filter the list of tags to only those that start with the prefix that was provided to the method. And then if the cursor was over here on tag 2, it would only provide a completion for tag 2 in that case. Or sorry, things that start with tag 2. And similarly here with T, it would only inject completions that start with T. Now we're seeing that happen here, but only because Sublime is smart enough to use the text that comes prior to the line. Notice the list of completions changes as the text prior changes, but on-query completions doesn't really keep getting called in that case because it already knows based on information that it has. Think of this as a custom completions file. Now, again, one thing we could do here, because we removed those completions, right now in this file, the only completions we see are completions that exist in the file. And similarly here, only tags we see are tags that appear in this file. Python doesn't appear in this file because it hasn't been injected yet. But there's no reason why we couldn't add our own tags to the list of tags that are returned from that find tags method that to inject our own settings or our own tags into that list. Now, one thing you could do there is have a global variable at the top of this whole file that stores your common tags. Or better, you could create a settings file that does that very thing. The settings file is something that we're going to talk about in the next video, where we are going to go ahead and convert this whole thing that's currently living in our user package into its own custom defined package, which would make it easier for us to share it with other users. But that is all of the long-winded talk we have for today's video. I would like to thank you for watching if you got this far, and please remember, if you have any questions on anything in this video, anything in the prior video, just anything on Sublime programming and plugin development and package development in general that you've always wondered about but you've never been able to find an adequate answer, send me a message at odatnerd@gmail.com right on the screen, or on Twitter at odatnerd. Leave a comment in the comments section below the video, and go ahead and subscribe, bell icon, and or thumb the video up or down if you found it helpful, unhelpful, and you want to see more. You probably don't want to subscribe if you found it unhelpful because most of the videos are going to be like this one. But your likes and your subscribes let me know that I am moving in the right direction with content on the channel. And with that, I will leave you at the end of this video with the now standard catchphrase, have a sublime day.